The wail of sirens cuts through the humid Texas night. Paramedics rush through automatic doors, wheeling a man whose screams echo through the emergency room corridors. His body convulses on the stretcher, skin pale as paper, sweat pouring down his face as he clutches his stomach in agony. The attending physician takes one look and immediately calls for backup. What they're seeing defies everything they know about medicine. Doctor's voice echoes through the halls. We thought he wouldn't survive the night. In 20 years of emergency medicine, I'd never seen anything like it. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from, and remember to subscribe for more true crime stories.
This is the story of Dashiell Montgomery, a 42-year-old policeman from Houston, Texas, whose search for love turned into a medical nightmare that would shock doctors, puzzle investigators, and ultimately expose a web of deception that nobody saw coming. After spending what he thought was a perfect evening with Quintessa Larkspur, a woman he'd met on a dating app, Dashiell woke up the next morning with his body literally rotting from the inside out. His organs were shutting down one by one, his skin was changing color, and the infection spreading through his bloodstream was unlike anything medical professionals had ever encountered. But how did a night of passion turn into one of the most disturbing medical mysteries in Texas history? And when police began digging into Quintessa's past, they uncovered something that would turn this case from a medical emergency into a full-blown criminal investigation. What they found would make you question everything you think you know about the people you invite into your life. Before we continue with this incredible story, let me ask you something. What would you do if someone you trusted, someone you thought cared about you, turned out to be harboring secrets that could destroy your life? How well do you really know the people you meet online? These are the questions that will haunt you after hearing what happened to Dashiell Montgomery. Who was this Texas man who just wanted to find love after his divorce? What drove him to that dating app where he met Quintessa Larkspur? And who was Quintessa really? Was she the nurturing, caring woman she claimed to be? Or was there something much darker hiding behind her warm smile and gentle words? Was this a freak medical accident? The kind of one-in-a-million tragedy that makes headlines for all the wrong reasons? Or was this something much more calculated, much more terrifying? Was Dashiell Montgomery a victim of the worst kind of luck? Or was he targeted by someone who knew exactly what she was doing? The answers to these questions will shock you. They shocked the doctors who fought to save Dashiell's life. They shocked the investigators who thought they'd seen everything in their years of police work, and they'll shock you too. On-screen text flashes. Who was Dashiell Montgomery? Who was Quintessa Larkspur? What really happened that night? Before we go deeper into this medical mystery, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Dashiell Montgomery ended up fighting for his life in that Houston emergency room, we need to go back 6 months earlier to a man who was simply trying to rebuild his life after everything fell apart. Dashiell wasn't your typical Texas man, making headlines for bizarre behavior. He was quiet, hard-working, the kind of guy who showed up early to patrol shifts and stayed late to make sure the job was done right. His steady hands told the story of decades spent protecting communities, while his own marriage crumbled around him. The divorce had been finalized just 8 months before that fateful night. 20 years of marriage gone, along with half his savings, his house, and regular contact with his teenage daughter, who chose to live with her mother in Dallas. Friends at work described Dashiell as a shell of his former self. Where once he'd been the guy cracking jokes during lunch breaks, now he ate alone, scrolling through his phone, probably looking at pictures of the life he used to have. That's what led him to the dating app. Not desperation, his friends would later insist, but loneliness. The kind of bone-deep loneliness that comes when you wake up every morning to silence, when you eat dinner watching TV shows alone, when you realize you haven't had a real conversation with another human being in weeks. Dashiell's profile was honest to a fault. Recent divorce, policeman looking for genuine connection, no shirtless bathroom selfies, no pickup lines about his truck or his boat, just a man who wanted someone to talk to, someone to share a meal with, someone who might fill the emptiness that had taken residence in his chest. Quintessa Larkspur's profile caught his attention immediately, but not for the reasons you might think. She wasn't the most conventionally attractive woman on the app, but there was something about her smile that seemed genuine. Her bio talked about loving to cook, enjoying quiet evenings watching movies, and being tired of games and drama. She was 38, worked as a home health aide, and had never been married. She described herself as nurturing by nature, someone who found joy in taking care of others. When they matched, their conversations flowed naturally.
Quintessa seemed genuinely interested in Dashiell's work, asking thoughtful questions about police cases and listening when he talked about missing his daughter. She shared stories about her patients, elderly folks she helped with daily tasks, and how rewarding it felt to make a difference in their lives. There were no red flags, no warning signs that would have made Dashiell swipe left or stop texting. But here's what Dashiell didn't know, what nobody knew at the time. Quintessa Larkspur had a past that she kept carefully hidden from her dating app matches, her co-workers, even her neighbors in the small apartment complex where she lived. 3 different men in 3 different Texas counties had experienced mysterious health issues after intimate encounters with women matching Quintessa's description. None of them had connected the dots. None of them had reported their experiences to police. They'd chalked it up to bad luck, to stress, to the kind of health problems that middle-aged men sometimes develop. The neighbors in Quintessa's apartment complex would later tell investigators that something about her felt off, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. She was friendly enough, always quick with a smile and a wave, but she kept to herself. Her apartment had thick curtains that were always drawn. She received packages frequently, medical supplies, and equipment that seemed odd for someone who worked as a home health aide. When asked about her work, she gave vague answers about helping elderly clients with basic needs, but she never mentioned specific names or locations. Mrs. Harlow, who lived next door, remembered hearing strange sounds from Quintessa's apartment late at night, not music or television, but what sounded like someone in distress groaning or crying out. When she'd mentioned it to Quintessa the next day, asking if everything was okay, Quintessa had laughed it off, claiming she was watching medical documentaries for continuing education. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but Mrs. Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Dashiell Montgomery had no way of knowing any of this when he drove to meet Quintessa for their first and only date. He'd showered, put on his nicest jeans, and a button-down shirt. His ex-wife had bought him years earlier. He'd even stopped to buy flowers, something he hadn't done since his dating days 25 years ago. As he pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, he felt nervous in a way that reminded him of being 16 again, butterflies dancing in his stomach at the prospect of connection, of hope, of maybe finding someone who could help him remember what it felt like to be happy. The evening started exactly as Dashiell had hoped it would. Quintessa answered her door wearing a sundress that complemented her warm smile, and she genuinely seemed delighted by the flowers. Her apartment was cozy, filled with the kind of furniture that looked lived in rather than staged, and something delicious was simmering on the stove. She'd made chicken and rice, she said, nothing fancy, but comfort food that reminded her of her grandmother's cooking. Over dinner, their conversation flowed as smoothly as it had over text. Quintessa asked about Dashiell's police duties, and he found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years about the satisfaction of protecting something permanent, something that would outlast him. She talked about her patients, describing an elderly man who taught her to play chess during her visits, and an elderly woman who shared stories about her late husband while Quintessa helped with household tasks. The way she spoke about caring for others made Dashiell feel like he was seeing a genuinely compassionate person, someone who might understand his own desire to take care of the people he loved. After dinner, they moved to her couch to watch a movie, some romantic comedy that neither of them paid much attention to. The conversation had shifted to more personal topics. Dashiell talked about the guilt he felt over his marriage ending, how he wondered if he'd been too focused on work, too absent when his family needed him most. Quintessa listened without judgment, her hand finding his, as she assured him that sometimes relationships simply run their course, that it didn't make him a bad person or a failure. When she leaned in to kiss him, it felt natural, like the culmination of months of careful conversation and growing trust. They moved to her bedroom, and what followed was intimate in a way Dashiell hadn't experienced in years. Not just the physical connection, but the emotional vulnerability of being with someone who seemed to genuinely care about his thoughts, his fears, his hopes for the future. For the first time since his divorce, Dashiell fell asleep feeling like maybe he wasn't destined to spend the rest of his life alone. He woke up around 3 in the morning with severe stomach cramps. At first he assumed it was something he'd eaten. Maybe his system wasn't used to home-cooked meals after months of fast food and frozen dinners. He made his way to Quintessa's bathroom, hoping not to wake her, but the pain was intensifying with each passing minute. What started as discomfort quickly escalated to agony that had him doubled over, struggling to breathe through waves of nausea and cramping. By 4 a.m., Dashiell was vomiting violently, and there was blood in what came up. Quintessa had woken up and found him collapsed on her bathroom floor, his skin clammy and pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. She called 911, her voice shaking as she described his symptoms to the dispatcher. While they waited for the ambulance, she held a cool washcloth to his forehead and kept saying she didn't understand what was happening, that he'd seemed fine when they went to bed. The paramedics who responded to the call would later describe Dashiell's condition as one of the most severe medical emergencies they'd encountered. His blood pressure was dangerously low, his temperature was spiking, and his abdomen was rigid with pain. One paramedic, veteran responder Maddox Cruz, with 15 years of experience, said it looked like someone had been poisoned, but there was no obvious source of toxins in Quintessa's apartment. During the ambulance ride to Houston General Hospital, Dashiell drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was lucid, he kept asking what was happening to him, why he felt like he was dying. The paramedics worked frantically to keep his vitals stable, pushing IV fluids and monitoring his heart rate, which was becoming increasingly erratic. Cruz radioed ahead to the emergency room, warning them to have the trauma team ready for what looked like a potential poisoning case. Quintessa followed the ambulance in her own car. But by the time she arrived at the hospital, Dashiell had been rushed into emergency surgery. His condition had deteriorated so rapidly that doctors didn't have time for extensive testing before they had to operate to save his life. What they found when they opened him up would haunt the surgical team for months afterward. Dr. Eloan Finch had been practicing emergency surgery for over a decade. She'd seen gunshot wounds, car accident victims, drug overdoses, and every kind of trauma the human body could endure. But when she opened up Dashiell Montgomery's abdomen, she found something that defied her medical training and experience. His internal organs were in a state of advanced necrosis, tissue death, that typically took days or weeks to develop, not hours. The infection spreading through his bloodstream was unlike anything in her medical textbooks. The tissue samples they sent to pathology came back with results that made no sense. Multiple types of bacteria that shouldn't coexist were somehow thriving in Dashiell's body, creating a perfect storm of infection that was systematically shutting down his organs. His liver was failing, his kidneys were barely functioning, and his white blood cell count was through the roof. As his immune system fought a battle, it was clearly losing. Dr. Finch called in infectious disease specialists from 3 different hospitals. They ran every test imaginable, looking for exotic parasites, rare bacterial infections, unusual viruses, even biological weapons that might cause this kind of rapid tissue death. Nothing fit the pattern they were seeing. One specialist, Dr. Kalen Reese from the University of Texas Medical Center, later said it was as if someone had introduced multiple pathogens into Dashiell's system simultaneously, but that would require deliberate medical knowledge and access to laboratory cultures. While doctors fought to save Dashiell's life, Quintessa Larkspur sat in the hospital waiting room, playing the role of concerned girlfriend perfectly. She brought coffee for the medical staff, asked thoughtful questions about Dashiell's condition, and even called his ex-wife to let her know what had happened. To everyone who saw her, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, a caring woman devastated by her new boyfriend's mysterious illness. But Detective Vesper Thorne of the Houston Police Department had been called in when the hospital reported a possible poisoning case, and something about Quintessa's demeanor bothered her. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing that would hold up in court. But in her 12 years as a detective, Thorne had developed an instinct for when someone wasn't telling the whole truth. Quintessa answered every question cooperatively, provided a detailed timeline of the evening, and seemed genuinely confused about what could have caused Dashiell's condition. Yet something felt rehearsed about her responses. Thorne began investigating Quintessa's background, while Dashiell remained in intensive care, his condition critical but stable. What she found was a woman with a surprisingly clean record. No arrests, no complaints, steady employment history as a home health aide. But when Thorne started digging deeper, talking to Quintessa's former employers and the families of her patients, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. 3 elderly patients Quintessa had cared for in the past 2 years had died of sudden medical complications. The deaths hadn't raised suspicions at the time because elderly patients with multiple health conditions often experience rapid declines. The families had been grateful for Quintessa's compassionate care during their loved ones' final days. She'd even attended 2 of the funerals, bringing flowers and offering comfort to grieving relatives. But Dr. Reyes, the infectious disease specialist, found similarities between Dashiell's condition and the symptoms described in the elderly patients' medical records before their deaths. Sudden onset of multiple infections, rapid organ failure, mysterious bacterial cultures that didn't respond to standard treatments. When Thorne requested that the bodies be exhumed for additional testing, she faced resistance from families who didn't want their loved ones disturbed, and from a legal system that required substantial evidence before authorizing such drastic measures. The media attention surrounding Dashiell's case had started small. a brief mention in local news about an unusual medical emergency. But as word spread through social media about the mysterious illness that had nearly killed a healthy 42-year-old man after a first date, national news outlets picked up the story. Reporters camped outside Quintessa's apartment complex and the hospital, desperate for details about what they were calling the date-night disease. Quintessa handled the media attention with the same composure she'd shown in the hospital waiting room. She gave a tearful interview to a local news station describing her shock at what had happened to Dashiell and her hope that doctors would find a way to save him. She portrayed herself as another victim, a woman whose search for love had been turned into a nightmare by circumstances beyond her control. If you're still with me through this disturbing case, type Texas in the comments. I want to see who's watching this far, because what comes next is going to challenge everything you think you know about this story. Detective Thorne wasn't buying Quintessa's performance. She expanded her investigation, looking at Quintessa's dating app activity, her financial records, her educational background. What she found was a woman who had been using multiple dating platforms for over 3 years, meeting men throughout Texas, but rarely maintaining relationships for more than a few weeks. Most troubling was Quintessa's educational background. She had actually completed 2 years of nursing school before dropping out, giving her enough medical knowledge to understand human anatomy and the effects of various pathogens on the body. The breakthrough in the case came when Thorne discovered that Quintessa had been ordering medical supplies online under her real name. Not just the basic equipment you'd expect a home health aide to have, but sophisticated laboratory tools, bacterial culture media, and antibiotics that were restricted to licensed medical facilities. When Thorne obtained a warrant to search Quintessa's apartment, what they found would turn this medical mystery into one of the most shocking criminal cases in Texas history. The search of Quintessa Larkspur's apartment revealed a home laboratory that looked more like something from a medical thriller than the cozy living space Dashiell had experienced on their date night. Hidden behind a false wall in her bedroom closet was a sophisticated setup for growing and maintaining bacterial cultures. She had petri dishes, incubators, microscopes, and detailed notebooks documenting experiments with different combinations of pathogens. Detective Thorne and the forensics team found journals dating back 3 years, filled with meticulous notes about the effects of various bacterial combinations on human tissue. Quintessa had been conducting what could only be described as human experimentation, using the elderly patients in her care, and the men she met through dating apps as unwitting test subjects for her twisted research. The journals revealed a mind that was both brilliant and deeply disturbed. Quintessa had legitimate medical knowledge. Her nursing school training had given her a solid foundation in anatomy and pathology. But somewhere along the way she had become obsessed with what she called accelerated mortality, finding ways to cause rapid organ failure that would mimic natural death in elderly patients and create mysterious illnesses in younger, healthier individuals. Her motivations were complex and chilling. Part of it seemed to be a God complex. She wrote about the power she felt when controlling whether someone lived or died. Part of it was financial. She had been stealing from elderly patients and their families, using her position as a trusted caregiver to access bank accounts and valuable possessions. But there was also a darker psychological component. Quintessa wrote about enjoying the grief of family members, the chaos that followed unexpected deaths, the way she could comfort people through losses she had actually caused. The most disturbing entries in her journal dealt with her dating app encounters. She referred to the men she met as subjects, and documented their symptoms with clinical detachment. Dashiell wasn't her first victim. He was just the first one healthy enough to survive long enough for medical professionals to investigate. 3 other men in different Texas counties had died from mysterious illnesses after brief relationships with women matching Quintessa's description, but their deaths had been attributed to natural causes or undiagnosed conditions. Dr. Reese, working with the FBI's Biological Crimes Unit, analyzed the bacterial cultures found in Quintessa's apartment. She had been creating what he called infection cocktails, combining multiple pathogens that would work together to overwhelm the human immune system. Her notebook showed she'd been refining these combinations for years, testing them on elderly patients who were expected to die anyway, then moving to younger subjects to see how healthy immune systems would respond. The evidence against Quintessa was overwhelming, but she maintained her innocence even after her arrest. In interrogation videos that would later be shown to the jury, she insisted that everything in her apartment was for legitimate research, that she was trying to develop new treatments for elderly patients suffering from multiple infections. She claimed the dating app encounters were genuine attempts to find love, and that any illnesses that followed were tragic coincidences. But her carefully constructed facade began to crack when Detective Thorne confronted her with testimony from Dashiell Montgomery, who had finally recovered enough to speak about his ordeal. From his hospital bed, Dashiell described the evening in detail, but also revealed something that hadn't come out before. Quintessa had insisted on preparing a special drink for him before they were intimate, something she called a love potion, that was just fruit juice and herbs, she claimed designed to enhance their connection. Dashiell remembered that the drink had a strange, slightly medicinal taste, but he'd assumed it was just unfamiliar herbs. Quintessa had been very insistent that he drink all of it, watching carefully to make sure he finished every drop. In retrospect, he realized she had been unusually attentive to the time, checking her phone frequently, as if she was timing something. The forensics team found traces of the bacterial cocktail in a blender in Quintessa's kitchen, confirming that she had indeed administered the pathogens orally, disguised in what Dashiell thought was a romantic gesture. The realization that someone he had trusted, someone he had been intimate with, had deliberately poisoned him, left Dashiell struggling with trust issues that would take years to overcome. But then investigators uncovered a piece of evidence that turned the entire case upside down and revealed the true scope of Quintessa's crimes. The piece of evidence that changed everything was a hard drive hidden in Quintessa's apartment, encrypted with sophisticated software that took the FBI's cybercrimes unit 3 weeks to crack. What they found on that drive was documentation of a network of women across the southeast United States, all sharing information about methods for what they called natural mortality enhancement. Quintessa hadn't been working alone. She was part of a group that the FBI would later call the Mercy Network. The women in this network had been sharing techniques for causing deaths that would appear natural, targeting elderly patients, abusive partners, and men they met through dating apps. They communicated through encrypted messaging apps, sharing recipes for bacterial cocktails, methods for introducing pathogens without detection, and strategies for avoiding investigation. Quintessa was actually one of the newer members of the group, which explained why her techniques were more crude and detectable than others in the network. The FBI investigation that followed would ultimately lead to arrests in 6 states and uncovered dozens of suspicious deaths that had previously been attributed to natural causes. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. These women had been operating for over 5 years, refining their methods and supporting each other in avoiding detection. During the trial, prosecutors painted Quintessa as a cold-blooded killer who had perverted her medical training to satisfy a twisted desire for control over life and death. The defense argued that she was mentally ill, suffering from a personality disorder that made her incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about her troubled childhood, her history of feeling powerless, and her desperate need to feel important and in control. The testimony from Dashiell Montgomery was devastating for the defense. He described not just the physical agony of nearly dying from Quintessa's poison, but the psychological trauma of realizing that someone he had trusted with his most vulnerable moments had been conducting experiments on his body. He spoke about the nightmares, the panic attacks whenever he tried to date again, the way the experience had shattered his ability to trust others. The families of Quintessa's elderly victims also testified, describing how they had welcomed her into their homes, trusted her with their most precious loved ones, and believed her tears of sympathy were genuine when their family members died. Learning that their grief had been orchestrated by someone they considered a friend was a betrayal that went beyond the original loss. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder for the elderly patients, 2 counts of attempted murder for Dashiell and another dating app victim who had survived, and multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, and practicing medicine without a license. But the story doesn't end with Quintessa's conviction. During sentencing, she made a statement that chilled everyone in the courtroom. She showed no remorse for her victims, instead expressing anger that her research had been misunderstood. She claimed that she had been working toward medical breakthroughs that could help millions of people, and that the deaths she caused were necessary sacrifices for the greater good of scientific advancement. The judge sentenced Quintessa Larkspur to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 200 years for the other charges. But even behind bars, she continued to maintain correspondence with other members of the Mercy Network until prison officials discovered her communications and placed her in solitary confinement. One question remains unanswered and continues to haunt investigators. How many other victims were there? Quintessa's journals only documented the cases where she kept detailed notes, but evidence suggests she may have been experimenting on people for much longer than the 3 years covered in her records. Families across Texas have requested that suspicious deaths be re-examined, and several cases are still under investigation. For Dashiell Montgomery, the legal resolution brought some closure, but the psychological scars remain. He spent 8 months in physical therapy recovering from the organ damage Quintessa's poison had caused. He underwent counseling to deal with the trauma of betrayal and the fear of trusting others. 21 years later, he's back to work in policing, but he's never returned to dating apps. The experience taught him that the person you think you're falling in love with might be conducting experiments on your body while you sleep. This case raises questions that go far beyond one woman's crimes. How well do you really know the people you meet online? How do you protect yourself from someone who has medical knowledge and the intention to use it against you? What would you have done in Dashiell's situation? Would you have been suspicious of that special drink? Or would you have trusted someone you thought cared about you? But perhaps the most disturbing question is this. How many Quintessa Larkspur cases are out there that we haven't discovered yet? How many mysterious deaths? How many unexplained illnesses? How many broken hearts are actually the result of calculated crimes by people we trust? I want to know what you think about this case. Do you believe this was a case of mental illness that led to horrific crimes? Or do you think Quintessa Larkspur knew exactly what she was doing and simply didn't care about the suffering she caused? Drop your thoughts below. We're reading every single comment and I'm genuinely curious about your reactions to this story. Have you ever had an experience where someone you trusted turned out to be completely different from who you thought they were? How did you recover from that betrayal? And what precautions do you take when meeting people through dating apps or online platforms? If you thought this story was disturbing, wait until you hear about the case we're covering next week. The man who buried his wife after she died in a car accident, only to have her show up at his door 10 years later, very much alive and with no memory of the past decade. The truth behind her disappearance involves human trafficking, medical experimentation, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss that story or any of our other investigations into the crimes that official authorities want to keep hidden. We're committed to bringing you the true crime stories that mainstream media won't touch. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime story.